Is this mic live? Yes. Welcome, everyone, to this September meeting of the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor. I'm with the CHAA. My name is Randy Schwartz. In the front row is our president, Mariam Breed. We're pleased that you can join us, whether in person or online, for today's talk by Chevallier, Brasseries, Bistros, and Bouillons. I want to thank our host for today's program, the Ann Arbor District Library, which provides promotional and technical support for us. Is it possible that these lights could be turned down or off? They're blinding. Thank you. Much better.
No, they can't see you on the screen.
That's all for the better.
Okay.
The library also makes it possible for our programs to be shared beyond the walls of the library by live streaming them and by recording and posting many of them on the library's video channel and YouTube. Based on the registration list, I know there's quite a lot of new viewers out in cyberspace, so I want to briefly introduce everyone to the Culinary Historians. We're an informal group bringing together all sorts of people who are interested in the history and culture of food and cooking. The group was formed back in 1983, and new members are always welcome. We have monthly talks like this one from September to May. Some of the speakers are in person here at the library, and others are online only, like today's speaker from California. We also have twice yearly potluck theme meals, usually in July and in November or December. Our November theme meal this year will be on the theme of apples, so people will be making dishes, apple-related dishes from all over the world and bringing them to share information about them. If you're not a member of CHAA, we'd love to have you join us. Our membership is $25 a year for either an individual or a couple, and it includes a subscription to our quarterly magazine, Repast. A postal subscription to Repast is only $20 a year, no matter what country you happen to live in. So if you'd like to join our group or just to subscribe to Repast, you can find the information on our website, culinaryhistoriansannarbor.org, by clicking on the membership tab there. You can also find us on Facebook. Just search for Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor and like our page to get our news into your timeline. Or if you're here in person, you can pick up a membership form on the side table over there. Also on the side table after the talk and after the Q&A session, we've brought some croissant and some apple cider, so help yourself to that then. We'll also be raffling off 2 books today. Paul Bocuse's French Cooking from 1977 and Le Cordon Bleu at Home from 1991. So if you haven't entered the free raffle, that can be done over at the side table as well. We'll do that raffle after the Q&A. Our next talk, 5 weeks from today, that's Sunday, October 20, will be presented by the University of Michigan history professor, Catherine French, titled Cooking in London After the Black Death. And now I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker. James Chevallier is a Los Angeles-based historian of French food who's written widely in other fields too, both fiction and nonfiction. In fact, it was Jim's work on an historical novel that first led him to the subject of food history, starting with an essay on breakfast in 18th century France. And then he wrote How to Cook a Peacock, which was a new translation of Taillevent's book, Le Viandier. He soon focused on bread, including the croissant and the baguette. A book that he wrote in 2009 revolutionized our understanding of the croissant. It was titled Auguste Zong and the French Croissant, How Viennoiserie Came to France. In 2019, he published Before the Baguette, The History of French Bread, followed a year later by They Came Bearing Bread, The Hard Lives of the Porteuses de Pain, which is an in-depth look at the lives of the women who delivered bread to in French cities from the late 1700s to the early 1900s. Other books that Jim has written include recently A History of the Food of Paris, From Roast Mammoth to Steak Frite, which Choice magazine named an outstanding academic title for 2019. And the book Feasting with the Franks, the first French medieval food, in 2021. Jim has also been writing a highly regarded blog on medieval and early modern food history for over a decade. It's called Les Leftovers. That is the leftovers. So look for that on Blogspot. Let's give a warm welcome to Jim Chevallier on the West Coast.
Should I see my face now here? Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, I am going to talk to you about the plethora of eateries which opened in 19th century Paris after the first great restaurants made it a capital of gastronomy. And some of these were carryovers from earlier times. Some were very specific to the 19th century, and some have endured until today. I'm going to begin with a classic moment in French food history, and that is the opening of the first place considered a restaurant. It was not called a restaurant, but it was on the Rue de Pouilly, which is now part of the Rue de Louvre, near the Quai Bourbon, or at the end of the Palais of the Louvre. It was called a restorer, a restaurateur, because there had been this fad for a health food item that was basically distilled bouillon called a restaurant. And that had been around for about 100 years, but suddenly there was this fad for them. And this serial entrepreneur named Rose de Champnoiseau had the idea of opening an outlet for restaurants. Now, he did serve some light foods, but probably because his flagship product was a liquid, he adopted the decor which had been mainly associated with cafes for quite a while, and that was small marble tables, gilt mirrors, brass fittings. And that made this new eatery, as it became, fancy in a way that had not been true of eateries. Cabarets and traiteurs were the main eateries. And by the way, you could eat well before the restaurant. That's one of the myths about the first restaurant, that it was the first place that served good food in public. But like a century before this, one cabaret was serving chicken en daube, and we have other evidence that cabarets were serving good food. But they were not fancy places. Nobody ever mentions the decor, whereas that quickly became one aspect of the restaurateur, who were imitated, and it became a fad, so that the traiteurs, who were the main meal providers, wanted in on this. So some of them began to sell restaurants, and they began to call themselves traiteurs restaurateur. Meanwhile, the restaurateur wanted to make more money, so they often got traiteurs licenses and called themselves restaurateur traiteur. So the two labels became all confused together. Meanwhile, as you might predict, the fad for restaurants ended, and you get to the 70s, 80s, what had been called traiteur were now called restaurateur, but they're rarely, if ever, selling restaurants anymore. Basically, the big thing they adopted from Eaux de Chamboiseau's facility was the decor. And that would become very important to restaurants in a way it had not been before in public eateries. Meanwhile, the Duke d'Orléans, who was a cousin to Louis XVI, had debts, and he had the idea of turning his Palais Royal, his royal palace, which was towards the center of Paris, into a sort of upscale mall. And he started work on it. And then towards the, say 1785, work was completed there, and people could now rent spaces and open a jewelry store, a bookstore, a cafe. And one of the first cafes there was called the Café de Chartres, first the Café de Conti, then the Café de Chartres, because the Duc d'Orléans was also the Duc de Chartres. We will return to the Café de Chartres. We are now within a few years of the Revolution, 1789, and you may have heard it said that the first great restaurants opened because the Revolution put aristocratic chefs out of employment, and so they needed other means of income. That's not entirely false, and people did say this at the time, but Rebecca Spang points out in The Invention of the Restaurant that some of the restaurants opened before the Revolution, and notably you had one that was opened by a man named Beauvilliers, who had been the chef for the Comte de Provence, who was Louis XVI's brother and would later become Louis XVIII. He did pretty well. He opened in this little corner of the Palais Royal. For some reason, he called his place the Grand Tavern of London. And if you're wondering why would anybody call a big fancy French restaurant a London tavern, later on, a food critic would credit the success of the restaurant to our love of all things English. And everyone knows the English always dine in the tavern. And in fact, if you read Samuel Pepys' diaries, for instance, you will see him going very often to have his meals in the tavern. This is an idea other people would repeat. There's this whole question of what other countries did in terms of dining out, and it's a separate question from us, but there were people who thought the whole idea of the restaurant, in fact, had its roots in the English taverns. Beauvilliers did well, but he also continued to host aristocrats and finally found it wisest to decamp, probably to London. Not a bad idea given that another chef who had been, I think, Marie Antoinette's chef, opened a place in the Palais Royal, but then ended up at the guillotine, supposedly for showing too much nostalgia for his former employers. Now, we were at the start of the revolution, you had the meeting of the Third Estate, which is to say the bourgeoisie, and they sent deputies from all over France with what were in effect expense accounts. And these deputies really liked these new restaurateurs, which was part of the source of the success of these early restaurants. So one man a few years later would complain in his diary that while people were lining up for bread, the revolutionaries were dining at these new restaurateurs. A man named Mayo, who had been the chef for the Prince of Condé, which is about as close to royalty as you could get without actually being royal, opened a place right near the Palais Royal in the Rue des Bons Enfants. The revolutionaries really liked Mayo's, Danton, Marat, and then for a while, Robespierre. He would stay open for about 13 years. Strangely, later on, people said that his was one of the most royalist places, but somehow he escaped unscathed. Meanwhile, two brothers named Véry came to Paris, and they opened a place in the Palais Royal, which would be one of the top places in Paris for decades. They also briefly opened a place by the Tuileries. So they were very important. We have a menu from me. It doesn't have any restaurants on it, but they do call themselves at this point restaurateur in the House of Equality, which was the politically correct name for the Palais Royal at this point. And again, they're calling themselves restaurateurs. It's still going to be some time before you see the term restaurant. Now, a somewhat maddening fact about this area is that with all the mention of these great restaurateurs, there's almost no images of them. And the images we do have, we owe to a murder. Because an aristocrat named Le Pelletier de Saint-Fargeau, who was very rich, but apparently tried to downplay the fact by eating at Février, which was one of the less elegant places in the Palais Real, voted to execute Louis XVI and was assassinated for his pains, which resulted in several images in the press of the time. Here's a somewhat fancier image, and you can see you have what looks like marble flooring. You have very nice murals on the wall and a landscape. And then out in the hallway, you see a counter. This kind of counter had been standard for cafes and now became standard for restaurants. Usually the owner's wife would take the money there. Here's another image, fairly similar. The landscape's not too different floor, but again, it looks like it's marble. And you see a similar single table off on one side with a carafe on it, as we had in the other image. And again, this counter outside. And these may be the only images we have of the very first great restaurants in Paris. Now, we get to 1800 and Napoleon takes full power. The revolutionaries did not approve of luxury. Napoleon loved luxury, and he established his own nobility. He revived to some degree the nobility of the old regime. Meanwhile, after years of war, a number of people had suspiciously become very rich. And years later, somebody would say, people are no longer fabulously wealthy as they were at the start of the century. This, of course, helped the new restaurateur. Beauvilliers returned to Paris, and he found a place on the Rue de Richelieu, which at that point was called the Street of the Law. Again, a sort of politically correct term. And it did very well. He again called his place the Great Tavern of London. Now, an Englishman named Blagden wrote a really delightful book, which you can find on Google Books, 2 volumes showing what Paris was like before and after the revolution. And one of the things he does is he introduces his English readers to these new French restaurateurs. He begins by shamelessly cribbing text from a man named Legacies, who's the Frenchman who first claimed that a man named Boulanger had founded the restaurant. And just about every claim going forward, as would be true for over a century, claiming that Boulanger founded the restaurant is just based on this one mention by Legacies, which was repeated in English by Blagden. But then Blagden hones in on one restaurant, and luckily for us, it is Beauvilliers. Luckily for us, partially because Beauvilliers was a very important restaurant, but also because it was fairly typical of the other great restaurants of the time. So this gives us a good look at what a great restaurant looked like at the start of the 19th century. He describes it on the first floor of a large hotel, a large private house, not a place to rent rooms. Formerly occupied perhaps by a farmer general, you enter a suite of apartments decorated with arabesques and mirrors of large dimensions in a style no less elegant than splendid, where tables are completely arranged for large or small parties. In winter, these rooms are warmed by ornamental stoves and lighted by quinquet, a species of Argan's lamp. And then he goes on to say that this space could hold hundreds of people, but there were somewhat less people in summer when people went off to their country houses. He then very helpfully sums up the menu, helpfully because the menus for these first great restaurants were very long. So it's handy to have them summed up, or at least one summed up in a paragraph. It will require half an hour at least to con over this important catalog. Let us see. Soups, 13 sorts. Hors d'oeuvre, 22 species. Beef, dressed in 11 different ways. pastry containing fish, flesh, and fowl in different ways. Pastry, did I say beef dressed in 11 different ways? Pastry, now pastry here was not the sweet that we know today. It was mainly food in past, in dough. And that meaning would hold through much of the 19th century, and there would be a pastry course on most menus for a very long time. Pastry containing fish, flesh, and fowl in 11 shapes, poultry and game under 32 various forms, veal amplified into 22 distinct articles, mutton confined to 17 only, fish, 23 varieties, roast meat, game, and poultry of 15 kinds, entremet or side dish to the number of 41 articles, dessert, 39, wines, including those of the liqueur kind, of 52 denominations, besides ale and porter, liqueur, 12 species together with coffee and ices. So you can see very crowded menus, but not only does he give us this nice little summary, he then reproduces Beauvillier's actual menu. And you see it was formerly the Great Tavern of the Republic in the Palace of Equality, now at the Rue de la Loi, number 142, which today is 26, and it's a completely different building, or I would show it to you. So here's the first page, the second page, the third page, the fourth page, the fifth page, the sixth page. The seventh page, we're about 2/3 of the way down, you see macaroni d'Italie au parmesan, which is to say mac and cheese, an enduring favorite. We have the 8th page and the 9th page. It was really long. Now, if you're wondering, did they actually have all these offerings? Well, one man says not really. A lot of the foods were there to make people come in the door and think they had everything. Blagden says that the portions were pretty small. And some of us who remember when Nouvelle Cuisine came along, remember one complaint was you had these big plates with just a little bit of food in the middle. And he says here it is as if the mountain were delivered of a mouse. He also says, and this is the only reference of this sort I've ever seen, that you should order your second course while you're working on your first course. So he seems to suggest that people were ordering course by course. I've never seen that in earlier mentions. I've never seen it going forward, but it may well have been true just at this moment of the first great restaurants. Beauvillier is the gift that keeps on giving, because not only did he open one of the great restaurants of the period, he wrote one of the great cookbooks. And it's also available in English. So if you're a cooking recreationist and would like to recreate some of the dishes from one of the great restaurants at the start of the 19th century, you can go to his menu, pick up various dishes, and then go to one of these cookbooks and find the recipes and serve your friends a meal from one of the first great restaurants in Paris. Very's was still open. Here we see Madame Very at her counter helping what is probably an English client, judging by the sort of satirical view. From 1803, we actually have an image of Very's, already much fancier than what we saw from a few years back. It's almost hard to believe this is one of the most elegant restaurants in Paris because the whole energy here is almost like a beer hall, but this was one of the top restaurants in Paris. And we have another menu for Very here, listing the one at the Palais Royal and the Tuileries, because there were two at one point. As you can see, if you printed all this in full-size print, you would have several pages. Here it's all been narrowed down to one page. This was published in several periodicals of the era. Now it's just Very Restaurateur, doesn't mention their brothers. And yes, it's a restaurateur, but again, no restaurants. The restaurants are long gone. Here we have Madame Very again at her counter with the latest hairstyle. And then cafes had become very popular places to eat of all types, at all levels, but some of the fancy ones were in the Palais Royal, including one where the columns were reflected by mirrors. So it was called 1,000 Columns, a cafe of 1,000 columns. The official name for a cafe was a lemonade vendor, limonadier, and people often call this picture La Belle Limonadière, a portrait of the owner's wife. Two brothers came up from Provence, actually three men came up from Provence and opened a place they called Les Frères Provençaux, Provençal brothers. Apparently they were actually in-laws, not brothers. As you can see, it was, again, a very good place and well above what we saw earlier at the start. And we have a menu for them too. And Les Trois Frères Provençaux would remain one of the top restaurants in Paris for a very long time. The place where Le Pelletier de Saint-Fargeau got assassinated was now owned by a man, Borel, who was something of a jokester and a mimic. So he put tubes running through the ceiling of his place. And if you asked for a friend, the friend's voice would suddenly appear at another end of the restaurant because Borel would imitate it and send it through one of these tubes. And some people called his place the ventriloquist. Now, the restaurant, the market, Les Halles, was a short distance away from the Palais Royal. And there was a street to the north of it called the Rue Montorgueil, it's still there today, where there was a shellfish market where you could buy snails and oysters. And there were places that actually served them. One being the Rock of Cancale. Cancale was a place in Normandy, very well known for its oysters. And the Rocher de Cancale was first on one side of the street, and then it would be moved to the other. It would remain one of the very top restaurants with Russian counts and famous writers like Balzac eating there all the way into the second half of the 19th century. It never completely disappeared, and it was still there at the start of the 20th century when Atget got a photograph of it. And it's still there today, and as you can see, they've rather gussied up the front in a 19th century mode. When I lived in Paris last, it was pretty much a neighborhood restaurant. If you look at their menu now, they seem to have upped their game a little bit. So you can go there and you can have a very nice standard meal, imagining that you are once again dining in one of the great restaurants of the 19th century. The Palais Royal somewhat declined. Now, you still had all these great restaurants in there, like Véry and the Trois Frères Provençaux. But now you see they have advertisements on the arcades, which certainly wasn't done earlier. If you could read the one towards the middle, it actually says Café Américain. So apparently there was an American cafe in there. I know nothing else about it. And you had women plying a trade, which was closely associated with the Palais Royal. So that was another aspect of the locale. Now you don't see here posters, but there were posters which advertised 22 sous restaurants. And these were certainly not refined restaurants, but you could indeed get a decent meal for 22 sous. So you had more and more bargain options in the Palais Royal and elsewhere. Meanwhile, way back in the 16th century, innkeepers began to offer their guests a set meal at a table, which was fictively called the host table, and you paid a set price, and you sat with strangers, and you ate what you were served. This was called a table d'hôte, and it's one of the reasons that you have the myth that the first restaurant was the first place that you could sit at separate tables, because that seems to be based on the idea that the only place to eat before the restaurant was a table d'hôte, when in fact there's all kinds of different options. And we have images of people long before that sitting at separate tables. You now had table d'hôte served by restaurants. I've got one image that's just a really rundown looking table d'hôte, but a man said that a lot of the table d'hôte had very good looking, well-dressed men, very beautiful women, and a newcomer was advised to completely avoid them because they were all cheap hustlers. You still had fancy cafes in the Palais Royal and elsewhere. An Englishman ate at the Café d'Orléans and found it very expensive at 11 francs 70 centimes. The most expensive items here were the wine and what they called the fruit, which might have been the dessert in general. These were very fancy, these cafes. Some were really quite handsome, really many restaurants, whose decor, after all, was based originally on the idea of cafes. One cafe which had survived from the founding of the Palais Royal and now attracted aristocrats from other countries and very well-off people was the Café de Chartres, which was still there. And then a cook, a chef named Véfour bought it. For a long time, it was still called the Café de Chartres, but over time, it rather inevitably became known as Véfour. And then his brother opened a place in the Palais Royal that became known as the Petit Véfour, the Little Véfour. And so the original has been known for a long time as Le Grand Véfour. It has closed and gone out of business more than once, I believe, but it's been back for quite a while and is now, again, one of the top restaurants in Paris. As you can see, it still touts its origin as a Café de Chartres. Véfour has the best documented claim to being the oldest restaurant in Paris. Now, I can hear the cries out in the universe, no, 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 I know this restaurant, it's much older. And I can only suggest that you take the date they claim, go to Google Books or Gallica, and constrain your search to that date followed by 100 years, during which time you would expect to see some mention of the restaurant in question, and you won't. You might find a place with the same name, but then you want to check the address, and you typically find it's not the same address. But Véfour has a very good claim. Now, the first places people dined out in Paris were taverns, and then cabarets, which originally were little more than cabarets with taverns with more pretensions. Both theoretically were wine shops. In fact, sometimes they weren't supposed to serve food at all. Clearly they did, and they were the main venues for quite a while for people to dine in. So these wine shops, to various degrees, survived in the 19th century. Taverns, not so much. You don't really see taverns, but you do see some places called cabarets, and you have wine shops. So here is a place that, judging by the grill work, was probably a 17th century cabaret. When you see photographs of the cabarets which survived long enough to be photographed from the 17th century, they all have this grill work. But here it's actually called Commerce des Vins, a wine shop. And what's more, off to the right, you see a restaurant. Now we see a restaurant because this is a wine shop that served food. Now, a lot of the places which serve food didn't really feel any necessity to change their name. They were still wine shops. There was a type of loaf called a wine shop loaf, pain marchand de vin, which is made explicitly for wine shops which serve food. But sometimes they did indeed change their names and become restaurants. Here's another one, it says Commerce de Vin at the bottom, and then Restaurant down below. And this place on the side street on the right bank is called the Tour d'Argent, as were numerous places over the centuries. Tour d'Argent, a silver tower, was a sign from heraldry. So lots of coats of arms had Tour d'Argent on them. You will hear this ludicrous explanation that the most famous place had mica on the roof, and that's why it was called the Silver Tower. Stuff and nonsense. No need to go so far. As the French say, it was just a common symbol from heraldry. Now, at the end of the 18th century, you begin to get guidebooks, annuaries, or basically I'm forgetting the exact word now, but like phone books, for those of us of a certain generation, they were just directories to Paris. But they were like phone books without phone numbers. Now, for younger people, a phone book was a very big, thick book with lots of little names listed alphabetically and addresses and phone numbers. And these were just the names and the addresses. And they lasted all through the 19th century. They're great fun to look at if Paris interests you in this period. And this is from around 1840. You see below the Rue Etienne Marcel, there's this little stretch of the Rue Montorgueil that's below it. And at 38, you had Bouillons, which was selling wine. It was a wine shop. And then a little bit later, you see Le Comte at the same address, selling wine, but also snails and oysters, the flagship products of the Rue Montorgueil. And then a little bit later, you just see a restaurant called The Snail at 38 Rue Montorgueil. It is 38, yeah, okay. And so you see this progress. It was not unusual from wine shop to restaurant. The Escargot for a while was a very upscale, very sought after restaurant. From all I can see, looking decade by decade, it never has gone out of business. It may have declined in a lot of ways, but it's still there today. You can have snail made any number of ways in the escargot on the Rue Montorgueil. And again, its origin, looking way back, was in wine shops. Now you did have places called cabarets. The Ile de la Cité, which is where you find Notre Dame today, is a fairly sterile neighborhood today, but for much of the 19th century, it was packed with crumbling old houses. It was a little dangerous as a neighborhood. Something like 60,000 people lived on the Rue de la Cité. Now, if that shocks you, bear in mind that it's called the island of the city because for a long time, that was Paris. The whole city was on that island. And you had this cabaret called the Cabaret of the White Rabbit. You can see the owner slumped down behind his counter with his shot glasses and a cask of brandy, a big stove over here. I don't know that it had food. I'm not sure that I would want to eat anything in this particular place, but a lot of the places called cabaret were outside Paris, including the Mother Marie's Cabaret, which looks really very like cabarets outside Paris earlier on. Just the way people are dressed is a little different. The article that goes with this image says that people were most likely to eat bread and onions at Mother Marie's. Now, going back to the 18th century, if you think of Paris as a clock and envision a little area above 10 o'clock outside the walls of Paris, there were a bunch of people there, a bunch of cabarets there in an area called La Courtille, and because it was outside the walls, the alcohol was cheaper. These are very popular, if not always very safe places called guinguettes, and guinguette would have several different meanings over the centuries. And the most famous was run by a man named Lampenoux. As you can see, it had a very lively cabaret. Then Paris expanded, all of this disappeared, but you get to the 19th century and a little bit above this area towards Montmartre, you had a drink stand, which again began to serve food and then bit by bit became a full-on eatery called Le Petit Ramponneau. And the Petit Ramponneau actually had a section for the poorer diners, and this section, judging by the top hats, was for the more upscale diners, and quite a kitchen, which is the whole charm of this image. You just see they had this really big, lively-looking kitchen. By the way, these loaves here look like baguette, but they're not. They're probably what were called jacos, but that's a whole other question of the bread of the 19th century. A big development in Paris in the 19th century was the Industrial Revolution. And in general, the end of feudalism meant that more people were working salaried labor. Some of them were from Paris or around Paris. Some were so-called foreigners, meaning they came from other regions of France, like Auvergne or Brittany. And some were actually from other countries, the Scandinavians. You had Italians, you had Spaniards. So you had all these new enclaves in Paris, and you had workers who typically were working far from home, and they had to be fed. So you began to get the first workers' restaurants. One was called the California, La Californie. You would order your food at the counter, and then you could order drinks when you were seated. This was near what is now Montparnasse, but at that point was near the outer walls of Paris. Apparently, there were several places of this sort in that area. You had all kinds of options now for workers. One was an outdoor restaurant. So the market, Les Halles, originally grew up around a cemetery called the Cemetery of the Innocents, which was filled in at the end of the 18th century. Then a greens market grew up on what was now the Square of the Innocents. And that fountain is still right near there. It's called the Fountain of the Innocents. And then you had workers' outdoor restaurants. One of these was run by a woman who supposedly knew who was a good worker, but just happened to be out of work. So she would feed him and his family for a week and was revered in the area. The article that goes with this image says that she fed 1,000 people a day. I have a little trouble in visualizing that, but that is what was claimed. Here's a closer look. You see the so-called restaurants were just tables with parasols, and then the kitchen was pretty much a campfire. But this fed a lot of workers. It was not the most primitive option by any means. So you had rag pickers whose work was considered a trade. It was one of the petits métiers, the little trades. If you go to the Rue Mouffetard today, it's a very nice little street, but for a long time it was a very rundown, sordid street inhabited mainly by rag pickers. And one of the places that catered to them had a long table with bowls cut into the wood and women who walked around with big vats and big droppers, and they would put the bouillon in your bowl. You were supposed to pay. If you didn't, they just took it right back out. Otherwise, they gave you some bread and some ironware. Another place that was mentioned by at least two people, it's been derided as satire, but at least two writers mention it full on, had a big vat with long forks in it, and very down and out diners would plunge the fork in for a very small price and hope they got some meat. And if they didn't, they got two more tries and they had to pay again. And supposedly some of them just loved the gambling side of this so much they didn't care if they didn't end up being fed. Now, again, it's claimed this is satire, but it's been reported. Another option, which will certainly seem hard to believe, except that it's very well documented. In the 18th century, people used to go around to the back doors of big houses and buy leftover meals, not leftover food, leftover meals. So a bit of veal that was half eaten, some crème brûlée that was spooned only somewhat, and they would buy it, and these people were called jewelers, bijoutiers, and then they would go to Les Halles and sell it to other vendors who would reconfigure all this into what were called harlequins. And that was still going on in the 19th century. So here we have marchand d'arlequin. If you weren't worried about germs, and not many people in 19th century Paris were, you could have the same food and maybe the bodily fluids of a count or a bishop or an industrialist at a modest price. So that was one option. This is so fascinating a subject that somebody this year just put out a whole book about it. So allow me to promote somebody else's book if you really want to follow up. This book is called The Harlequin Eaters. I'm sure many people here know that potatoes were not popular in France till the end of the 18th century, when not only did they become acceptable, but people began to sell fried potatoes, mainly on the Pont Neuf at first. And that has been an enduring taste, of course. Originally, they were just sliced off the end of the potato into little rounds. It wasn't until about 1860 that you began to get the kind of julienne shape we know today. But you would just get some paper. For a long time, it was just newspaper, but a French friend tells me that was banned because newsprint had lead in it. So it really wasn't a very healthy way to hold your food. But people would buy their potatoes and they go sit by the Seine, or they go to a cafe and order some wine, and that was their lunch. One bad nutritional habit for which the French cannot blame us, there's a fair number of for which they can, is the love of fried food. And you had fried food vendors, probably selling fish. I'm not sure what all the fried foods were they sold, but they carried their own stoves. You had to be careful not to trip. And then you see that loaf in back of her. It has a split down the middle, and it was called a split, a fondue. It was almost the baguette of its time. It was the loaf that a maid would pick up on her way home in the evening or her way back to her employers. So here she probably cut off some bread and gave it to her customers along with their fried food, which the French really like. Chestnuts mainly in the winter, chestnuts began to be sold. The first chestnut vendor in New York was French, and when he died, it was such a big deal, the newspaper covered it. But I believe that the first chestnut vendors were Auvergnat. This is one of many trades people from Auvergne took on to make a living, as they were basically immigrants in their capital city. They had a distinct look, which this wine company found useful. One of the things they did was they sold coal, but when they sold coal, they also sold coffee and wine, and basically opened what were called cafés charbon. We're very lucky that one of these has survived on the Rue Oberkampf and is now a somewhat trendy place called the Charbon Cafe. That if you're young and want to have fun, the Rue Oberkampf, last time I went, was one of the top places to do it. And they have revived some old places. By the way, long, long ago, it was famous for its cabarets, and Cartouche, very famous bandit, was caught in a cabaret on what is now the Rue Oberkampf. Women were working, and they didn't necessarily want to eat in cafes, which were, after all, mainly bars. So they went to creameries, which were exactly what they sound like, at least initially. They had cream and milk and bread and coffee. But they were a place to snack. Here we have a really cute ad where a cat sharing some cream. And often they began to serve more substantial foods, to the point that they sometimes became restaurants. The most famous example being what many people call that restaurant in Woody Allen's Midnight in Paris, Polydor. And as you can see, Polydor advertises that it began as a crèmerie. It was most known now for its life in the 20s with American writers, but it's a 19th century restaurant. It's been around for a very long time. It did indeed begin as a crèmerie. Then there's another place that has not endured, but was very popular with the English and the Americans at the time. The painter Whistler really liked Madame Busque, and Madame Busque learned to make pumpkin pie, and probably some other American specialties. An argument might be made that hers was one of the first American restaurants in Paris, even though it was not known as such. But we have a very nice description of Madame Busque's from an English writer named Salah, and he begins with an idea of what the place had been. We entered a very little shop on whose tiny window panes are emblazoned half-effaced legends in yellow paint relative to eggs, milk, cream, coffee, and broth at all hours. Some tall loaves were leaning up in a corner as if they were tired of being the staff of life and wanted to rest themselves. There were no eggs, broth, cream, or coffee to be seen, but there was a pleasant odor of cooking palpable to the olfactory nerves, and this was all. The second table was, the round table, rather, was of simple oak, and there was no tablecloth. The chairs were straw-bottomed and exceedingly comfortable. The floor was tiled and sanded. A solitary but very large wax candle burnt in an iron candlestick. Pepper was a superfluity, so excellently seasoned were the dishes. At intervals, hands appeared very much in the white cat fashion and tendered sardines, olives, the mild cheese of Brie, the pungent Roquefort, and the porous Gruyere. I had as good, plentiful, clean, well-dressed a dinner as ever Brillat-Savarin or Dr. Kitchener would ever have desired to sit down to. So it's an appetizing description of Madame Busque's, and one rather wishes it had survived. There's been a slight effort in recent years to at least revive the idea of a creamery. Now, as I remember, this place didn't have any dairy products at all, but it certainly pays homage to the old idea of the crèmerie. This way of eating bouillon was very varied. So you had a woman at the Halles who carried around her vats and then gave her customers Bowls, again, germs were not a consideration. You had little holes in the wall that also would serve you bouillon. And in 1838, a Dutch company had the idea of opening a chain. This was the first chain restaurant, not only in Paris, but probably in Europe, probably in America, and so far as I can tell, in the world. I don't know of any Asian chain restaurants, for instance, at this point. Of course, everybody knows the 14th century famous restaurants in Asia, but not chain restaurants. And these did okay. They mainly did serve bouillon. They were apparently pretty good looking places, but they didn't last that long. So here we have a bankruptcy from 1854. And if you look at the addresses at the bottom, you see the various places where there were what were called bouillon hollandaise. That's how people referred to these places. About the time that this place went out of business, a French butcher named Duval picked up on the idea. The usual line about Duval is that he had excess meat and wanted to monetize it, so he began to sell bouillon just to workers. And then his places became so popular that he made a greater effort. And as you can see, they were often very handsome places. They were also so common at one point, they became like Starbucks. You were never really very far from a Bouillon Duval. Initially, they served very modest offerings, and you got a card with just a few items on it. You would tick off the things you wanted, and then when you went to the counter, that was your bill. Duval can be regarded a little bit as a French Ray Kroc, first of all, because he took somebody else's idea and commercialized it more efficiently, but also he had some basic principles, much like Ray Kroc, of cleanliness, economy, and forget the other options, but you know, a few different things: efficiency, cleanliness, economy. The Bouillon de Val were also very well known for their servers, who were women, which was not always the case. They had a very distinctive uniform. They were, of course, very proper, poised women. And they originally refused tips. Later on, they were supposedly paid by tips, but they were a very popular subject in the art of the time. They also were allowed to sit down, which male servers were not. Now, Duval himself became fabulously rich. His son Alexander was a notorious playboy who squired around some very expensive beauties, but somehow the chain kept going all the way into the 20th century. It also had imitators, notably two brothers named Chartier, who opened most of their places probably at the start of the 20th century. And their places, too, were very elegant, very economical. One of them lasted all the way into, well, today, basically. When I was a student, this place was just called Chartier, and it was very cheap. And we were told that there were still drawers there where customers used to put their napkins. And so we were told to go to Chartier for a cheap meal. I think this is where I had beef salad one day, which I thought of as a very Parisian dish. At some point, they started calling them bouillon Chartier again because they realized it's become a selling point. Meanwhile, the flagship of the system, Le Grand Bouillon, Camille Chartier, for a long time became the dining room for the Sorbonne faculty. And then sometime in the 90s, they began to restore it, largely with the help of what are called les meilleurs ouvriers de France. And these are people who often practice crafts which have otherwise been forgotten. Notre Dame is largely being restored by meilleurs ouvriers de France. And the result, as you can see, which is still there, is quite handsome. So here it's on the Rue Racine, so now they call it the Bouillon Racine. But very nice place. And apparently there's another place they're restoring. There's also a restaurant called the Vaginen where they still have the remnants of another bouillon, I think from the Duval. And there's a few places, if you look around, that still retain the decor of the old bouillons. Now, the big central market in Paris had been around for hundreds of years. It had been moved about a bit and restored, but never on a grand scale until past the middle of the 19th century when it was moved to these beautiful iron and glass by Batard, which were inexplicably and shamefully demolished, believe it or not, at the start of the 70s. One is still on the outskirts of Paris, one's in Japan. Why they didn't repurpose them is beyond me, but they didn't. So this is what they looked like for a long time. And there were a lot of restaurants in this area. Restaurants because the workers would arrive at 3 in the morning. So a lot of the restaurants had licenses to be open all night. They were called restaurants de nuit. And then the swells would take advantage of the fact that these restaurants were open all night, and they would come down from Montmartre, where they often had fun late, and they would amuse themselves looking at all those quaint workers in their smocks. That must have gone over big with the workers. And then they would go upstairs to where the better places were, with dance, music, and much better food, and sometimes other goings on. In fact, there's one mention of a private detective, or maybe not so private, undercover, because they were looking around for all the skullduggery that went on in the more elegant parts of these restaurants de nuit. But a number of these places are still here. So the Pale Tranquille was there before they built the pavilions. And you see here, there's an American bar on the second floor. It is somewhere, I think there's a mention of music. And you can see the market. You can see all the detritus from the market. Here's a somewhat neater picture with yet carts from the market. And it's still there today. You can still sit outside and just have a coffee. You can go have lunch. It is one of the original eateries of Les Halles. It gives you a little taste of what the nightlife was like in that area. Another place had been called the Little Norman Woman, but became known as Pharamond, which is the name of a mythical French king, and was most known for serving tripe in the style of Caen, which is a place in Normandy. And at one point, they pretty much had 4 dishes, which was the tripe, which you could take all elsewhere. It's still there. It's overdone the Norm theme to my taste, but you can see at the top it had really a big Normand, and then Pharamond below, and now it's a pretty full-on restaurant. There was another place called the Sheep's Foot. And this was popular with people like Colette and Cocteau. Supposedly Cocteau was having dinner one day and telling all his friends how much he hated Colette's new novel. And then he went to pay, and the waiter said, "Oh, monsieur, there was a woman sitting behind you, and she did not look happy." And Colette and Cocteau said, "Oh, I'm going to have to write a letter to dear Colette." That went out of business, but meanwhile, another place opened called the Foot. And I ate the pig's foot very late at night. I actually ate a pig's foot, which filled with bones. But there were these places which to before the market was destroyed, and they're quite a treat to look at if you want some idea what the nightlife was like around Les Halles. Now we get to 1870, the Franco-Prussian War is on, Paris is besieged, rats are being sold in the marketplace. There's a book with recipes for dog. There had been a movement already underfoot encouraging eating horse meat. Now people had to eat horse meat. And after the siege was over, a lot of people kept doing it. And so to this day, you have boucheries chevalines, horse butcheries. I don't know any French people who eat horse meat, but it has endured in Paris ever since. And you have this menu, which some people claim is satirical for Christmas, but everything on it is perfectly credible when you know what people are eating at this point. It says consommé d'éléphant. Well, the elephant in the zoo was killed about this time, so it's perfectly possible they were serving elephant consommé. The French lost the Franco-Prussian War, and with it, Alsace and Lorraine, which are more Germanic Eastern provinces. People fled, a lot of them, and largely went to Paris. Among them were Jews. This is interesting because when Jews were exiled from France, a lot of them went to Alsace and to Metz. So it's quite possible a lot of these people were descended from the original Jews in France. They brought with them Ashkenaz cuisine, the more Germanic Ashkenaz cuisine. And in fact, it's suggested that some of the dishes are just older German dishes which have been preserved in that particular cuisine. Later, at the start of the 20th century, you get Russian Jews and a slightly different cuisine from them. And it would be quite a while before you got Sephardic cuisine, which is now pretty common in Paris. One thing Parisians loved about Alsace was its beer. And so you began to get Alsatian breweries. The French word for brewery is brasserie, and the brasserie served Alsatian specialties, notably choucroute, which simply means sauerkraut, but a choucroute garni is with slices of ham and sausages, and some people just love it. So, of course, the brasserie served that. They sometimes serve onion soup, which isn't particularly Alsatian, but does give you an idea how hearty the fare was. Around this time, they opened the Boulevard Saint-Germain, and a man named Leonard Lipp opened what he called the Brasserie of the banks of the Rhine, and then the Brasserie Lipp, which has endured. For a long time, this neighborhood was filled with publishers, and so this became a literary hangout. They actually give a literary prize. It's also a big hangout for a lot of politicians. And the De Magot, which of course was the existentialist hangout, is right across the street. So all of this was driven by publishers who I think are less common in that area now. Another brasserie that opened back then is still around was Beaufanger. Now, suppose Beaufanger introduced tap beer with pressure, with gas. I have not been able to absolutely verify that, but that is what they claim. Beaufanger, by the way, is right near where the end of the Bastille used to be. Another type of brasserie was a brasserie of women, de femmes, not pour femmes, but of women, because the servers were women. As you can see, the servers are also sitting with the clients, which usually would be a no-no, but apparently their main product was not the food. Now, the actual trade they practiced was perfectly legal in its place, but licensed and under control, and I don't think these places were licensed. Here we have what is supposedly a lady of the brasserie, whom I have strategically endowed with a beer mug. So this was one of the frequenters of a brasserie de femmes. Now, a facility which had existed in eateries since the 17th century, at least, when one man described a place outside Paris where there was a room where couples could eat and then be left alone to, as he puts it, pay homage to Venus. This still existed at the start of the 19th century when Blagden mentioned cabinet particulier, private rooms, private offices. Here, two persons who have any secret affairs to settle enjoy all possible privacy, for even the waiter never has the imprudence to enter without being called. In these asylums, love arranges under his laws many individuals not suspected of sacrificing at the shrine of that wonder-working deity. And he goes on to say that women otherwise seen as prudes in public were somewhat less so in a cabinet particulier. These probably existed all through the 19th century, but they became particularly visible in the late 19th century, and all the best restaurants had them. Everybody knew exactly what they were used for, but not only were they not shameful, it would have been unthinkable for a really good restaurant not to have a cabinet particulier. Typically, they advertised that there were separate entrances to the cabinet particulier. One man wrote that a man who took a woman to a cabinet was expected to pay through the nose for overpriced delicacies, which might never get eaten, chilled champagne, and all this might be rewarded, the writer says, with nothing more than a rustling of lace. But some men took their mistresses, some men took women whose price was negotiated in advance. So certainly they got the use for which they were intended. Here's a rather, cleaned image of a cabinet particularly. They didn't have anything so crass as beds, but they did have love seats. So, you could manage what you went there to do. I've seen it claimed that what killed the cabinet particulier was the automobile, because these were almost like the motel rooms of their time, and now people with the car could drive out to the outskirts and actually find a little inn and do what they needed to do there. 1889, we get and I should say, by the way, the cabinet particulier were part of a whole sensibility, especially towards the turn of the century, where you had very elegant closed houses, maisons closes, which were shameful in a way, so they were closed off. But once you got there, they were very elegant and refined. And you also had women who were called half worldly, demi-mondaine, which is supposedly a phrase that came from Alexandre Dumas. Nobody defines this very precisely, but my own idea is that to be in society, in le monde, was to be mondaine. But these women practiced a trade that was more often hidden away, as in the closed houses, and yet they were received in society. In fact, sometimes they were squired around by very affluent and prominent men who were quite proud to be seen with women whose price was known and whose trade was known, who nonetheless were figures of some glamour and almost like movie stars. Their nickname was Les Belles Horizontales, the beautiful horizontal ones. So again, nobody had any illusions as to how they made their money, and yet they were figures of some glamour. And the cabinet particulier was part of this, at this point, were part of this mixture of elegance and eroticism. So we get to the World's Fair and the Eiffel Tower. And there were eateries in the Eiffel Tower, including around four sides of that central core. I don't know if I could have kept my lunch in looking down that view, but supposedly there was a French restaurant, an English-American restaurant, which is really confounding your cuisines, a Flemish restaurant, and I believe the other was Italian. If you go to YouTube and find the old Gigi, not the beautiful American film, but the French version that preceded it, early on, they show you a scene in the upscale restaurant in the Eiffel Tower. When I worked in Paris in the 80s, I ate at the Jules Verne, which is the big fancy restaurant there now. And it was lovely. You have candlelight on crystal where you look out through the girders and you see the glittering night sky of Paris. It's just wonderful if somebody else is paying. So here we have a little view of what it must have looked like from the outside. I guess they weren't too worried about breezes or people falling. Now, Catholic groups did not like the fact that women were going out to eat in cafes and places. So some of them opened what they called restaurant for women. But you certainly see the general feel of it. It lasted into the 30s and sometimes had a very institutional air about them. And they must have been very welcome to women. I don't know why they closed. Meanwhile, outside Paris, there's a lovely royal sort of mini Versailles called the Parc de Sceaux. And the town of Sceaux itself was, among other things, known for its chestnut trees. And people began to find really big chestnut trees out there and build what looked like tree houses in them. These were restaurants. The most famous was called Le Robinson, as in Swiss family Robinson. And several other people opened these. Now the neighboring area is called Plessis Robinson. One of them endured long enough for Atget to photograph it. And now we get to other names for wine shops, notably Mastroquet. And sometimes you'll see the word troquet. Now, there's no food mentioned here, but probably some of these places serve food. You also get the word bistrot, which puts paid to a common claim that the word bistrot arrived in 1814 when Russian soldiers would snap bistro, meaning quickly. But in fact, the word doesn't appear at all until the end of the 19th century. One school of thought is that it was originally a regional word for a goat herd. The word apparently applied to the owners originally, not to the place. And you can see where anyone who had to ride herd might be compared to a goat herd. Some of them now began to have zinc counters, and you will sometimes see such places called zinc, which is a term you still find. A bistro has never been clearly defined. It seems to have been very much like the old wine bars. You could have wine and you could have a decent, substantial meal. And of course, they've endured into the present time. There are still places where you can just go in and have some wine and a perfectly nice meal. You might just see a cafe that says it's a tea salon and a bistro, and who's to say differently since neither term is very carefully defined. Almost 20 years ago, the younger chefs in big fancy hotel restaurants wanted to have simpler outlets. So they opened bistros that were cheaper than the restaurants they were working at. They weren't particularly cheap and still aren't particularly cheap, but you could eat very well. And this whole movement was called bistronomy and has endured, I think, to this present time. So the word bistro has had all kinds of meanings, all kinds of uses. And there are lots of other places that I haven't had time to mention, but which are in my book, A History of the Food of Paris, from Roast Mammoth to Steak Fleet. And with that, I thank you for listening. So,
All right.
I probably should have kept that graphic up. Anyway, should I be hearing somebody here?
Yeah. So
Good.
can we hear? Okay. All right. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll come around to you. We may. Yes, to all the viewing audience. Yes, and yeah, if you're online, send your questions into the chat on YouTube. We have someone here who will be able to voice your question, and we can get an answer to that as well.
Just kind of a dumb question, but when one of the first things you said was those bouillon was fermented what? I couldn't hear the word.
I think you may be confounding the initial restaurant, which were associated with the first restaurants, which there was they were the restaurant, the restaurant was not fermented, it was distilled. It was a distilled bouillon. So they would take meat bouillons, a mixture of meat bouillons, and put them through a distillation apparatus, just like you would for alcohol. And supposedly that made it a much healthier sort of brew. And there was this big health food fad. Rebecca Spang goes into it in some detail in her book about how you had this mixture that's been around for about 100 years, but suddenly it was a health food fad. And then Rose de Champenoise had the idea of opening a place which served it, but it was distilled, it wasn't fermented.
I was wondering if you knew about how and why the word menu arose, and its relation to the word la carte for the same thing, apparently.
Well, originally, menu means little, like menu plaisir is a little pleasures. And apparently it was in big households, they used to have a list in menu detail, listing in detail what was to be served at that night's meal. So that was the original menu. Now, card had several different meanings over time. It was the carte payant was the bill. So you got a carte payant as a bill. And I'm not absolutely sure when carte was applied to the list of foods. I think that happened pretty early on, but originally, a lot of the big restaurants, they didn't have cards, they had books. You got a whole booklet. So it may have taken some time before it was reduced to something like the second menu for Very we saw, which was like a card. And I can't remember if carte payant was distinguished from carte for the food with another word, or if they just moved right to carte. But I've never quite traced exactly the evolution. But originally, menu was from the word small, so it was small details.
Hello, could you please tell us about the chef Anton Karim at that time and his pastries, I guess, like Napoleon, like multi-loaf, thousand
Well,
loaf?
he began as a pastry chef. He was actually trained as a pastry chef. And when I said that pastry was not a sweet initially, it was made, it was food made in dough. That's the sort of thing he first made. And that's how he became a chef at a very young age. He was very young, Callum, when he started. And he actually wrote a book on pastry, as I recall, Pastisserie, and then became a full-on chef. He didn't have much to do with restaurants because he mainly, he often went abroad to work for private clients. So I don't, I'm not an expert on the foods he made, except that he began to rationalize cooking in a way that Escoffier would later carry to a much more advanced degree. And so, he gets a lot. I think he's the one who first came up with the idea with the brigade, the kitchen brigade. It might have been Escoffier, but I think it was Carême. So I know scattered things about Carême, but I'm not really an expert on the whole history of French chefs, which, goes from actually, we have a brief mention of one of, is it Louis XIII? No, it's one of the early medieval king chefs, Louis IX, I think, and then Taïwan, and then you begin to have them in the 17th century, and you have cookbooks by these chefs, and then you get into the 19th century, and Carême is the first to really transform the idea of what a chef did. But that's a whole other talk, really. So. I know the chef, I think it was St. Louis' chef. In fact, he was prisoner with him when St. Louis was captured during the Crusades.
Karen has a question. In general, was all the food prepared in-house at most of these locations, and did they start reaching out to the pâtisserie in a boulangerie for pastries and bread?
Well, bread was made by bakers. It was very rare for a chef to make bread. Actually, Carême, when he went abroad, had to make his own bread. So in one of his cookbooks, he actually tells people how to make bread, but that's very rare to have an actual recipe for bread. That was considered the province of the bakers. I don't know for sure about the pastries. Under the old regime, only pastry chefs could make pastry. They were part of a coopération, which had the exclusive right to make pastry. But that was no longer true after the revolution. And I would imagine that a lot of these places made their own pâtisserie. And I think if you look in Beauvillier's cookbooks, you'll see recipes for pâtisserie. So I think that the pastry chefs were mainly selling basically takeout, selling to individuals. But I really don't know for sure that the restaurants did not sometimes actually, if you had a particularly good pastry chef, you might find it better to use their pastry than your own. But nobody really mentioned this in talking about the various restaurants. Nobody, as they do, by the way, in the earlier time, because again, the pastry chefs had a monopoly, but nobody really mentions it in talking about Beauvillier or Véry or any of these people.
Any others online? Well, if there are no other questions, please join me in giving one more round of applause to our presenter today.